Okay, some unusually semi-relevant context. Last year, as part of our sister series annual Halloween feature, Schlocktober, we featured a look back at the infamously bad 1970s TV horror movie Killdozer, which is about a possessed bulldozer and is about as good as it sounds. Now, this ended up kind of disappointing some fans, probably not as much as actually making them watch Killdozer would have though, who hadn't realized that Killdozer had originally been the name of a movie, and before that a science fiction short story, and instead thought I was doing an episode about a real-life event that has come to be more prominently associated with the Killdozer name, specifically a violent 2004 revenge spree across a small Colorado town by a deranged man using a modified, heavy armored and weaponized bulldozer that has come to be popularly known as the Killdozer Rampage. The actual event, during which thankfully no one but the perpetrator, a 52-year-old muffler repairman and snowmobile enthusiast named Marvin Hemeyer, in case this already didn't sound enough like the Coen brothers version of First Blood, was killed, dying by self-inflicted gunshot after his vehicle became trapped in a collapsed basement, only lasted over 2 hours, and while superficially novel, didn't leave a lot of questions to be answered or mysteries to be solved. But since it involved a self-righteous angry loner building a visually interesting DIY weapon of war that could be nicknamed in a mock cringing reference to something from pop culture, the internet has managed to turn Hemeyer and the Killdozer into something like a winking, ironic, but not really folk hero, now particularly popular among the so-called Boogaloo Boy militant movement, which, you know what, I don't get paid enough to explain what the etymology of that whole thing is. I will note that if you're asking, why don't I remember this happening? Well, the very next day, former President Reagan died, so nobody remembers that this happened. Just gonna let that one hover. Anyway, Tread is a new documentary from director Paul Sallet, who was previously best known as a horror filmmaker via the deeply unnerving Something's Wrong with the Baby shocker Grace from 2009. Remember that one, which correctly identifies the so-called Killdozer Rampage as something out of a B-grade horror film sprung absurdly but also tragically to life, and indeed delivers an action movie-style third act, impressively and realistically but also dramatically restaging recreations of the dozer and the attack itself, but also takes the unexpected and supremely satisfying tack of pointing its camera directly at the survivors, queuing up Marvin Hemeyer's own self-recorded rants as to his own rationale and view of himself, and in doing so basically letting pop culture's myth of the Killdozer as an even ironically cool blaze of glory moment utterly eviscerate itself on the whirring blades of reality. Retold in clean thirds, always beginning with Hemeyer's posthumously recovered own words and interviews with those who knew him best or thought they did, the story proceeds in a linear fashion, starting out as that of a seemingly affable and well-liked expert welder who moves to a small town, makes many friends, and sets himself up as a wildly successful local businessman before getting into a series of expensive, but one would imagine most would consider manageable, non-apocalyptic disagreements with other local builders over zoning regulations, building codes, and septic line disputes. It's that kind of small town, which from his perspective reveal a roiling Tammany Hall but in rural Colorado style political conspiracy directed against him specifically, which induces a paranoid withdrawal from which his only recourse is to build the Killdozer and raze the town to the ground as some sort of divine retribution payback. What's fascinating, and a good argument for having genre filmmakers direct non-fiction documentaries more often, is that Sallet effectively pulls off something like a gotcha by actually letting Hemeyer's version of events, complete with selective editing, music choices, and color timing in the recreations that dominate much of the we didn't have footage for this part, put us directly into his head for his self-justifying narrative about the town, its players, and the corrupt old boys network, so he calls it, allied against him, to the point where it all sounds familiar and cinematic enough that you can see why the moldier sellers of the web identify with this person as some kind of kindred spirit, only to then hit the audience with a combination of tonal whiplash and mounting horror as everything shifts at about the midpoint. You see, that's when the literal and figurative lights come up, and in the cold light of day, Tread starts flipping its cards over to milk the reveal of its winning hand. The conspiracy of villains, turn out to be a town full of disarmingly wholesome, blue-collar, normal folks. Most of the financial issues at play did in fact appear to be Hemeyer either just being stubborn or negligent. Even then it was clear it was going to break even or come out ahead for him in the deal. And most of those he believed aligned against him claim they never took issue with him, line up again and again to corroborate that they never got the sense he was as angry as he apparently was, and that most of his major personal moments of grievance apparently never took place. Basically, we hear the villain build himself as a righteous anti-hero as he's building the Killdozer, then get a broader picture where he comes off more like just one more entitled yuppie who sets up shop in a small town to indulge his expensive snowmobile hobby, throws a mantrum when things don't go exactly his way, and turns out to just have some serious psychological issues. Just in time for those personal manifesto tape recordings to roll over to the "God spoke to me and told me my mission on Earth was to build and pilot a giant weapon of war" part. So yeah, and that's not to say that Tread is aiming to be some kind of hit piece, that Hemeyer isn't exactly a rare species of middle-aged loner just because he got slightly more creative with his self-righteous violence. Doesn't mean there's nothing to study in his character study, and while Celette isn't editorializing here, there's enough left in the various interviews expressing puzzlement and regret for not noticing something to catch a sense of thesis about the ways respectful isolation and not my business non-intervention, especially when it comes to emotionally damaged men, can allow fractured psyches like this to curdle into something much worse. But you know, what impresses me the most is, after all the build-up and the presumed selling point of, yeah, we rebuilt and restaged the Killdozer Rampage, Celette doesn't let Tread fall into the trap of letting the bad guy become the protagonist just by virtue of being cool looking. The finale is exciting, but also actually tense and scary, even though we know how it ends. The actual machine and its rampage are filmed like a monster in the literal sense. The Killdozer is big and loud and ugly and hard to get a sense of its shape and purpose, and you just want everyone to get the hell away from the thing. And while I've understood, for the most part, why people were interested from an engineering standpoint as to how he made the damn thing, seeing this all play out, how much deliberate destruction it did, how close he comes to killing dozens of people, including a bunch of children and several cops because he's outfitted the whole thing with high-powered rifles. You know, with the preceding context of how completely petty and meaningless all the stuff that supposedly drove him to this. I mean, by the time it gets to the part with a rampage where he's destroying a public library and a children's playground, again, both barely evacuated in time, you know, because the town is really so small that that building is also the town hall that he's got a grudge against, I realize this is like the first thing close to a monster movie where I can remember watching, and instead of feeling excited or horrified, all I felt was this all too familiar sense of, man, what an asshole. Which I guess explains why some people do still think this was cool. There's a big world full of exactly this dude, but thankfully only one of them actually built himself a Killdozer. Still, a subject doesn't need to be deep for its documentary to be interesting. Tread is excellently made, has a great finish, offers some great bullshit-washing catharsis, and also maybe more insight into its subject perhaps deserved. 8 out of 10, fascinating, entertaining, and very worthwhile. Tread is now on Netflix. Check it out.